In a quiet valley surrounded by rolling hills, there was a small creek that had been the heart of the community for as long as anyone could remember. Willow Creek wasn't just water flowing over rocks. It was life itself. It gave farmers fresh water to grow their crops, provided a home for fish and birds, and offered kids a place to splash around on hot summer days. The sound of its gentle current was like background music for everyone who lived nearby. For generations, people in the EB area respected the creek. They knew it was more than just part of the landscape. It was something that connected them all. But things started to change when big trucks rolled into town one day. Developers came with shiny brochures showing pictures of luxury homes perched high above the valley. These weren't ordinary houses. They were mansions with sprawling lawns, glass walls, and infinity pools overlooking the scenery below. The developers called this new project Ridgeview Estates, promising it would bring wealth and prestige to the area. At first, most locals were skeptical. This was a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's names. Some worried about what these outsiders might do to the land they loved so much. Others saw an opportunity, jobs during construction, maybe even selling off some unused land for extra cash. Either way, no one really stood in the way when bulldozers began tearing up parts of the forest near the creek. One woman, whose family had lived near the creek for decades, watched everything unfold with growing unease. Her grandparents used to tell stories about how the creek had saved them during droughts and floods alike. Now she walked her dog along the same path every morning, listening to the familiar gurgle of water rushing over stones. She couldn't help but feel uneasy whenever she passed the construction site. Something about those massive machines digging trenches and pouring concrete felt wrong. As months went by, rumors spread among the townsfolk. People whispered that the developers wanted to fix the creek to stop erosion, a problem that supposedly threatened the expensive homes being built upstream. Engineers held meetings at the local hall, explaining their plans with charts and graphs. They promised the work wouldn't harm the environment. In fact, they said, reinforcing the banks with concrete would make the creek safer for everyone. But not everyone bought it. A group of environmentalists showed up at one meeting armed with studies and photos of similar projects gone wrong. They warned that messing with the natural flow of water could have disastrous consequences. The woman listened carefully, nodding along as the experts explained how creeks like Willow worked best when left alone. Nature had spent thousands of years perfecting its design, they argued. Why mess with perfection? Despite the warnings, the Homeowners Association HOA in charge of Ridgeview Estates pushed ahead. They dismissed the concerns as fear-mongering, insisting their plan was foolproof. After all, they argued modern engineering could solve any problem. And besides, didn't the locals want the economic boost that came with fancy new neighbors? Construction moved quickly after that. Soon enough, the once wild banks of Willow Creek were lined with smooth gray concrete. From a distance, it looked neat and orderly, like someone had combed out the tangles in nature's hair. New homeowners moved in, marveling at the pristine views and manicured lawns. Everything seemed fine, for a while. The woman kept walking her dog along the creek, though now she noticed subtle changes. The water didn't babble quite the same way anymore. Birds that used to nest nearby seemed fewer in number. Even the air felt different somehow, heavier, quieter. Still, life went on. People adapted, or at least they thought they had. Looking back, it's easy to see how everything fell apart, but at the time, no one realized just how fragile the balance between humans and nature truly was. That little creek, which had flowed peacefully through the valley for centuries, was about to teach everyone a lesson they'd never forget. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be a gentle one. For the first couple of years after the construction wrapped up, Ridgeview Estates seemed like a dream come true. The developers had delivered on their promises: luxury homes with breathtaking views, perfectly trimmed lawns, and amenities that made it feel more like a resort than a neighborhood. People who moved in were thrilled. They hosted barbecues by their infinity pools, sipped coffee while gazing at the valley below, and bragged to friends about living in such an exclusive community. It was paradise, or so it appeared. The Homeowners Association, HOA, took great pride in keeping everything looking perfect. Every blade of grass was cut to the exact same length. Flower beds burst with color all year round, thanks to professional landscapers. And then there was the creek, or rather what they'd turned the creek into. The concrete-lined banks looked sleek and modern, almost like a sculpture. To the untrained eye, it seemed like a brilliant solution, a way to control nature without losing its beauty. But appearances can be deceiving. Upstream from the fancy homes, cracks began to show, literally. One morning, an older man living near the edge of the development noticed something strange in his backyard. A small fissure had formed in the ground, zigzagging across the lawn like a lightning bolt frozen in time. He shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe the soil had shifted slightly due to recent rain. But over the next few weeks, the crack grew, wider. Then another one appeared nearby. Soon, his once pristine yard looked like a jigsaw puzzle someone had started but never finished. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. Another homeowner reported seeing water pooling under her deck, even though it hadn't rained in days. Someone else found soggy patches forming in their garden, killing off prized rose bushes. At first, these incidents seemed isolated, random even. No one connected the dots yet. After all, why would they? The HOA kept reassuring everyone that everything was fine. "It's just settling," they said during meetings. "These things happen when you build on hillsides." But the woman who lived downstream, the one whose family had been tied to the land for generations, knew better. She'd seen enough signs to suspect trouble brewing. Her dog refused to walk along certain stretches of the creek anymore, whining and tugging at the leash whenever she tried. When she inspected closer, she saw why. The water level was rising unnaturally high in places, pooling against the concrete barriers instead of flowing freely. Tiny rivulets snaked through the soil uphill, carving miniature trenches where none had existed before. She decided to dig deeper, not literally, but figuratively. She reached out to local experts, including hydrologists and ecologists, asking them to take a look at what was happening. Most agreed to visit out of curiosity, if nothing else. What they found confirmed her worst fears. By altering the natural flow of the creek, the developers had disrupted the delicate balance that kept the entire ecosystem functioning smoothly. Instead of letting water meander gently downhill, the concrete walls forced it to rush faster and harder, creating pressure points upstream. Over time, this unnatural force destabilized the surrounding soil, leading to sinkholes and flooding. When she presented her findings to the HOA, hoping to spark action, they brushed her off. "You're overreacting," one board member told her bluntly during a tense meeting. "If there was a real problem, we'd know about it already. Trust us. We hired the best engineers." That phrase, "trust us," became their mantra, repeated ad nauseum whenever anyone raised concerns. Frustrated but determined, she turned to other residents. Surely they'd listen if she explained the risks clearly enough. But getting through to them wasn't easy. Many were too busy enjoying their new lives to worry about potential problems. Others assumed the HOA must have done its homework. Who were they to question professionals, especially when those professionals had degrees and expensive suits? Still, she persisted. She organized informal gatherings at her house, inviting neighbors to hear first-hand accounts from the experts she'd consulted. Slowly but surely, a few people started paying attention. One couple admitted they'd been worried about the water pooling near their foundation, but didn't want to rock the boat. Another confessed they'd spotted erosion creeping toward their property line, but figured it was just bad luck. Together, this small group began documenting every issue they could find. Photos of cracked driveways, videos of muddy streams cutting through backyards, notes detailing suspicious patterns of dampness inside basements. They compiled everything into a presentation and scheduled a special meeting with the HOA. Surely, they thought, presenting hard evidence would force the board to act. The night of the meeting arrived, and the room buzzed with nervous energy. As slides flicked across the projector screen, showing photo after photo of damage and instability, the mood shifted from skepticism to unease. Even some members of the HOA looked visibly uncomfortable. But when it came time for questions, the response was predictable. "We'll look into it," they promised vaguely. "Rest assured, your safety is our top priority." Behind closed doors, however, tension simmered. Board members argued over whether admitting fault might open the door to lawsuits. Some suggested hiring independent consultants to double-check the claims, while others pushed back, insisting it would waste money on unnecessary precautions. Meanwhile, outside the gated community, the weather forecast hinted at storms brewing on the horizon. No one paid much attention to it. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Nature doesn't wait for humans to get their act together. Sooner or later, the creek would reclaim what belonged to it, and when that happened, no amount of concrete or denial would hold it back. The summer of 2017 started off like any other. The air was thick with humidity. Cicadas buzzed in the trees, and the occasional afternoon thunderstorm rolled through, leaving behind a fresh, earthy smell. But this year, something felt different. The storm seemed to linger longer, dumping more rain than usual. Weather reports warned of an unusually active monsoon season, but no one at Ridgeview Estates paid much attention. After all, they'd been told time and again that their homes were built to withstand anything nature could throw at them. At first, the rains were manageable. Showers soaked the ground, turning lawns into vibrant shades of green and filling the creek to the brim. The concrete barriers along the banks held steady, channeling water downstream just as the engineers had promised. Homeowners went about their lives, enjoying barbecues and pool parties, blissfully unaware of what was brewing above them. But then, the weather took a turn for the worse. A massive storm system moved in, parking itself over the valley for 3 days straight. Rain poured down relentlessly, relentless sheets of water hammering rooftops and flooding streets. Creeks and rivers across the region swelled dangerously, breaching their banks in places. Emergency alerts flashed on phones, urging people to evacuate low-lying areas. Yet up on the ridge where Ridgeview Estates stood, residents clung to the belief that they were safe. They had paid millions for those homes after all. Surely they were protected. On the second night of the storm, cracks began to form in that illusion. The woman who lived near the untouched part of the creek woke up to the sound of rushing water louder than she'd ever heard before. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, her heart pounding. What she saw made her blood run cold. The creek, normally calm and predictable, was now a raging torrent, its waters slamming against the concrete walls like a prisoner desperate to break free. Even from a distance, she could see the strain, the way the force of the water pushed against the barriers, testing their limits. She called a neighbor who lived closer to Ridgeview Estates, urging them to check if everything was okay. "It's fine," came the dismissive reply. "We're on higher ground. Nothing's going to happen here." Reluctantly, she hung up, but the unease gnawed at her. Unable to sleep, she spent the rest of the night pacing, watching the sky flash with lightning and listening to the deafening roar of the storm. By the third day, the situation had become dire. The entire valley was drowning. Roads turned into rivers, cars floated away, and emergency services struggled to keep up with calls for help. And then, just after midnight, it happened. With a sound like thunder but deeper, more guttural, part of the concrete embankment at Ridgeview Estates gave way. A wall of mud, water, and debris surged forward, obliterating everything in its path. Panic erupted almost instantly. Alarms blared as floodwaters tore through basements and garages, swallowing furniture, appliances, and priceless belongings. Families scrambled out of bed, grabbing whatever they could carry as icy water lapped at their ankles, then knees, then waists. Some tried to drive away, only to find their vehicles swept off the road by the current. Others huddled on rooftops, clinging to each other and praying for rescue. One homeowner later described the scene as apocalyptic. "It was like the earth itself was fighting back," he said, his voice trembling. You could hear the crack of trees snapping, the crash of walls collapsing. It wasn't just water, it was destruction personified. Amid the chaos, the HOA board members were nowhere to be found. Their promises of safety and stability now rang hollow as residents realized they'd been sold a lie. The very structures meant to protect them had failed catastrophically, unleashing a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Miraculously, no one died that night, though several people were injured. By dawn, the storm had begun to ease, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something unrecognizable. Luxury homes that once gleamed under the sun were reduced to soggy ruins. Expensive cars sat half-submerged in muck. Mud caked every surface, giving the neighborhood the eerie appearance of a swamp, a far cry from the paradise it had been marketed as. News crews arrived shortly afterward, capturing footage of the devastation. Reporters interviewed shaken homeowners, many of whom broke down in tears as they recounted losing everything. One woman held up a photo album salvaged from the wreckage, its pages smeared with dirt. "This is all I have left," she whispered, her voice cracking. Another man gestured toward the remains of his dream home. "I worked my whole life for this," he said bitterly, "and now it's gone." The story quickly went viral, drawing national attention. Headlines dubbed the disaster the Swamp of Broken Dreams, a grim reminder of humanity's hubris in trying to tame nature. Social media lit up with outrage as people criticized the developers and the HOA for ignoring warnings and prioritizing profit over safety. Lawyers descended on the area, offering free consultations to victims eager to hold someone accountable. Meanwhile, the woman who had sounded the alarm months earlier watched the aftermath unfold with a mix of sorrow and vindication. She hadn't wanted to be right. No one does. But seeing the evidence of her warnings play out so dramatically was both heartbreaking and infuriating. As she walked along the edge of the flooded zone, dodging chunks of concrete and twisted metal, she couldn't help but think about how differently things might have turned out if people had listened sooner. Over the following weeks, cleanup efforts began, though progress was slow. Bulldozers hauled away debris and pumps worked around the clock to drain standing water. Insurance adjusters combed through the wreckage, assessing damages and fielding endless questions from frustrated homeowners. Many decided not to rebuild, opting instead to cut their losses and move on. Those who stayed faced skyrocketing premiums and plummeting property values, making it harder to recover financially. For the HOA, the fallout was swift and brutal. Lawsuits piled up, accusing them of negligence, fraud, and gross mismanagement. Board members resigned en masse, disappearing from public view as investigations unfolded. Eventually, the organization dissolved altogether, leaving residents to fend for themselves. The once mighty gate at the entrance to Ridgeview Estate stood abandoned, its gold lettering faded and chipped, a silent testament to the hubris that had brought the community to its knees. As the dust settled, the woman found herself thrust into an unexpected role: advocate for change. Neighbors who had once dismissed her concerns now sought her advice, looking to her as a voice of reason in a sea of uncertainty. Together, they began discussing ways to prevent such a disaster from happening again, not just for themselves, but for future generations. For the first time in years, the focus shifted away from luxury and exclusivity and toward something far more important: sustainability. The storm may have destroyed homes, but it also exposed truths that could no longer be ignored. Nature wasn't something to conquer or control. It demanded respect, care, and understanding. And as painful as the lessons had been, they carried within them the seeds of redemption, if only people were willing to listen. In the months following the flood, Ridgeview Estates became a ghost town. The once gleaming mansions were now hollowed-out shells, their windows shattered, walls streaked with mud, and foundations weakened by the relentless force of water. Some homes had collapsed entirely, leaving behind jagged piles of debris that looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Others stood eerily intact but abandoned, their empty rooms echoing with memories of happier times. The fancy gates at the entrance, once symbols of wealth and exclusivity, were chained shut, rusting in the rain. For those who stayed, life was a daily struggle. A handful of residents refused to leave, clinging to what little they had left. They patched up their homes as best they could, using tarps to cover gaping holes in roofs and plywood to block broken windows. But it wasn't just about fixing physical damage. It was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest. Many felt betrayed, not just by nature, but by the people who had promised them safety and security. The HOA, which had dissolved amidst lawsuits and scandal, was gone, leaving behind a mess no one wanted to clean up. The woman who had tried to warn everyone found herself at the center of a growing movement. At first, she didn't seek attention. She simply wanted answers and justice for what had happened. But as more people reached out to her, sharing their stories and frustrations, she realized she had a unique role to play. Her deep connection to the land, combined with her determination to make things right, made her a natural leader. So she stepped up. She started small, organizing meetings in her modest home. Neighbors gathered around her kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking, late into the night about what to do next. Some were angry, others scared, but all shared a common goal: to rebuild, not just their homes, but their community. Slowly, ideas began to take shape. What if they could undo some of the damage done to the creek? What if they restored it to its natural state instead of trying to control it with concrete? The idea gained traction quickly. It wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Restoring Willow Creek would be a way to heal not only the land, but also the wounds inflicted on the community. With renewed energy, the group reached out to environmental organizations, local universities, and even national conservation groups for help. To their surprise, support poured in from unexpected places. Experts offered guidance, volunteers signed up to lend a hand, and donors contributed funds to kickstart the project. But getting started wasn't easy. Years of neglect and poor planning had left the creek in bad shape. The concrete barriers that remained were crumbling, trapping sediment and choking off wildlife habitats. Invasive plants had taken root along the banks, crowding out native species. And then there was the lingering mistrust among residents. Not everyone believed restoration was possible or worth the effort. Some argued it was too late, that the damage was irreversible. Others worried about cost and whether they'd see any real benefits. To address these concerns, the woman and her team focused on education. They invited hydrologists, ecologists, and engineers to give presentations explaining how restoring the creek could prevent future disasters. They showed before and after photos of similar projects elsewhere, demonstrating how communities had transformed barren, damaged landscapes into thriving ecosystems. Most importantly, they emphasized that this wasn't just about aesthetics or nostalgia. It was about survival. If they didn't fix the creek now, history would repeat itself. Fundraising events brought the community together in ways no one had anticipated. Bake sales, garage sales, and charity auctions drew crowds far beyond Ridgeview Estates. Local businesses donated goods and services, while musicians held benefit concerts under makeshift tents. Social media played a big role too, spreading awareness and rallying support from across the country. Donations came in from strangers who had seen news coverage of the disaster and wanted to help. As money rolled in, work began. Volunteers arrived in droves. Students, retirees, families with young kids, all eager to pitch in. Teams worked tirelessly to remove the remaining concrete barriers piece by painstaking piece. Heavy machinery hauled away chunks of debris, while smaller crews used shovels and picks to clear out clogged sections of the creek bed. Native trees and grasses were planted along the banks, their roots designed to stabilize the soil naturally. Engineers installed permeable barriers made from rocks and logs, allowing water to flow freely without causing erosion. It wasn't glamorous work. Days were long, hands were blistered, and progress often felt slow. But there was a sense of purpose that kept everyone going. For the first time in years, the community felt united, not divided by wealth or status, but bound together by a shared mission. People laughed and joked as they worked side by side, sharing meals and stories. Kids played in the dirt, building tiny dams with sticks and stones. Even the skeptics softened, seeing firsthand how much care and effort went into every step of the process. Over time, subtle changes began to appear. Water flowed more smoothly through the creek, carving gentle curves instead of slamming against rigid walls. Fish returned. darting through clear pools where none had been seen in years. Birds nested in newly planted trees, their songs filling the air once again. Wildflowers sprouted along the banks, painting the landscape with bursts of color. The transformation was slow but undeniable, a testament to the resilience of both nature and people. For the woman leading the charge, these signs of renewal brought a mix of emotions. Pride certainly, but also a bittersweet recognition of what had been lost. She thought often about the early days when developers first arrived, full of promises and glossy brochures. How different things might have been if they'd listened to the warnings back then, if they'd respected the creek instead of trying to bend it to their will. Still, dwelling on what-ifs wouldn't change the present. What mattered now was moving forward. By the end of the second year, Ridgeview Estates looked almost unrecognizable. Gone were the ostentatious mansions and manicured lawns. In their place stood modest cottages built with sustainability in mind. Roofs were covered in solar panels, gardens overflowed with vegetables and herbs, and rain barrels collected water for irrigation. The gated entrance was dismantled, replaced by a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek Community." Life here was quieter now, humbler, but it was also richer in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. Neighbors knew each other's names again. Kids rode bikes down unpaved roads, waving to passers-by. On summer evenings, laughter rang out from backyard barbecues, the smell of grilled food mingling with the fresh scent of wildflowers. The creek, once a source of destruction, had become a lifeline, a reminder of the power and beauty of nature when treated with respect. Looking back, it was hard to believe how far they'd come. From devastation to redemption, from division to unity, the journey had been anything but easy. But perhaps that was the point. Healing never is. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And sometimes, it requires losing everything to truly understand what matters most. Years after the flood, Ridgeview Estates, or what was now called Willow Creek Community, had transformed into something entirely different. The scars of the past were still visible if you looked closely. A cracked foundation here, an overgrown patch of land there, or the occasional rusted piece of rebar poking out from the soil. But these remnants served as reminders rather than eyesores. They told a story, a lesson etched into the landscape about the dangers of ignoring nature's warnings and the resilience that comes from working together. The woman who had stood alone in her convictions years ago was now a respected figure in the community. She wasn't flashy or loud, she didn't seek attention. Instead, she led by example, showing up every day to tend to the creek and its surroundings. Her hands were calloused from years of planting saplings, pulling weeds, and clearing debris. Yet when asked why she kept going, she'd simply smile and say, "This place is alive again because we listened." And it was true. Willow Creek was thriving in ways no one could have imagined during those dark days after the storm. Fish darted through crystal-clear pools, their scales glinting in the sunlight. Birds nested along the banks, raising chicks that would grow strong enough to fly south for winter. Deer wandered cautiously out of the woods at dawn, drinking from shallow parts of the stream before bounding back into the forest. Even insects buzzed happily around wildflowers, completing the circle of life that had been disrupted for so long. But the changes weren't limited to the natural world. The people who lived nearby had also undergone a transformation. Gone were the pretenses of wealth and exclusivity that had defined Ridgeview Estates. In their place was a sense of authenticity, a shared understanding that true value came not from material possessions but from relationships, hard work, and respect for the environment. Neighbors helped each other without expecting anything in return. Whether it was fixing a leaky roof, sharing fresh produce from backyard gardens, or lending tools for weekend projects, everyone contributed in their own way. One of the most profound shifts was how the community approached challenges. When disagreements arose, and they did, they were handled with open dialogue rather than dismissal. Monthly meetings became a staple, held outdoors under the shade of newly planted trees. Anyone could speak, whether they were longtime residents or newcomers drawn to the area by stories of its rebirth. Decisions were made collectively, ensuring that everyone felt heard and valued. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments of frustration and compromise, but the spirit of collaboration remained unshaken. Education played a big role in this new chapter. Local schools started bringing students to Willow Creek for field trips, teaching them about ecosystems, conservation, and the importance of living sustainably. Kids learned firsthand how concrete barriers had once harmed the creek, and how removing them allowed water to flow naturally. They planted trees alongside volunteers, leaving behind tiny markers with their names written on them. Years later, those same children would return as teenagers, marveling at how tall their saplings had grown. The woman often joined these visits, sharing her experiences with wide-eyed kids eager to hear her stories. She showed them photos of the flood, pointing out where homes used to stand and explaining how greed and short-sightedness had nearly destroyed everything. Then she'd lead them to the restored sections of the creek, letting them dip their fingers into the cool, clean water. "See?" she'd say with a grin. "Even when things seem broken beyond repair, they can heal, if we let them." Her words resonated far beyond the valley. News outlets continued to cover the restoration project, highlighting it as a model for sustainable development worldwide. Urban planners visited to study the techniques used to stabilize the banks without harming the ecosystem. Environmentalists praised the community for prioritizing long-term health over short-term profits. And tourists began trickling in, curious to see the place where luxury homes had given way to harmony with nature. Yet, despite all the recognition, the community never lost sight of what truly mattered. Success wasn't measured in awards or headlines. It was seen in everyday moments, like the elderly couple who finally managed to grow tomatoes in their garden after years of struggling with poor soil, or the young family whose kids built forts among the reeds laughing until their cheeks hurt, or the quiet evenings when neighbors gathered around bonfires, swapping stories while fireflies danced in the darkness. Still, the lessons of Willow Creek weren't confined to its borders. The disaster had sparked conversations across the country about the risks of unchecked development and the need for smarter, more sustainable practices. Towns facing similar threats took note, implementing measures to protect their own watersheds. Developers, wary of repeating the mistakes made at Ridgeview Estates, began consulting ecologists and hydrologists early in the planning process. Slowly but surely, the ripple effects of the community's efforts spread outward, inspiring change far beyond what anyone could have predicted. For the woman, the journey wasn't just about redemption. It was about legacy. She knew she wouldn't live forever, but she found comfort in knowing that her actions had set something meaningful in motion. Future generations would inherit a healthier, more balanced world, not because of luck, but because people had chosen to learn from their mistakes. On sunny afternoons, she liked to sit by the creek with a thermos of tea, watching the water dance over smooth stones. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and listen to the sounds around her, the rustling leaves, the chirping birds, the gentle burble of flowing water. It reminded her of simpler times, before bulldozers and blueprints disrupted the valley's rhythm. Opening her eyes, she'd take in the view. Modest cottages nestled among trees, children playing near the bank, and a community united by purpose. It wasn't paradise in the traditional sense, but it was something better. It was real, it was earned, and it was proof that even after the worst disasters, hope could bloom like wildflowers in spring. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the valley, she'd smile to herself. Nature always finds a way, she thought. And so do we, if we're willing to listen.